And I'm excited to be on as well as to chat with our panelists for today.
Marvelous. Thank you for being here, Reverend McIntyre.
Thank you, Reverend Dean. Yeah, so we'll get started in just a few moments. So hi, Dr. Williams. This is Reverend McIntyre, and we'll go over a lot of this in a few minutes. The way that the webinar is set up is that we'll be able to see the participants who are here, and we'll have some conversation first with the panelists. And after we have conversation with the panelists, then we will open it up for questions, in which case I'll be able to have your questions raised. You can raise your hand, etc. If you have a question that comes up before we get to the question and answer portion, then you are able to type your question into the box and we'll see them and we will get to them when we are able to do so. But we can see you all and we're excited to have the participants we have on. No, I cannot hear you. Hold on, let me see. No, we can't hear you unless we bring you in to be heard. So you can type your answer here, but you won't be heard unless we actually invite you in for the conversation. So you'll have to raise your hand or enter your question first. If you all would, while we are waiting, if you all could go ahead and just text in the box, can you all tell us where you all are from? Can you just where you're logging in from, or even where you might work, so that we can have an idea of who all is on today? Oh, hold on. All right. So we do actually have, hey, hold on one second. We do actually have Dr. Williams on. I do apologize. I just realized how this works. We need to upgrade you to a panelist so that we can get you in. Maybe can you assist us with that, please? Thank you. Hi. Hold on. Can you, perfect. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. Great. We apologize for the delay. We sometimes trying to figure out how Zoom works for everyone is a little difficult. So thank you so much. All right. So, all right. So why don't we go ahead and get started? First things first. Again, my name is Reverend Amina McIntyre, and I'm going to be the moderator for this evening. And we're so excited to have Dr. Monica Williams on. Dr. Monica Williams is a board-certified licensed clinical psychologist and associate professor at the University of Connecticut in the Department of Psychological Sciences and Department of Psychiatry. She's also the clinical director of the Behavioral Wellness Clinic, and her research focuses on African American mental health, culture, and psychopathology. And she has published over 100 scientific articles on all of these topics. And so she's someone who's one of the leading researchers in race-based trauma. And we are so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. Sorry about the technical delay again.
It's okay, no problem. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that Churches Uniting in Christ did last year was to start looking at how mental health and race, just race, gender, and just all different kinds of things that are happening in the world and in our society have played an impact on people's mental health. And so this year we wanted to go a little bit deeper and talk a little bit more about that specific subject. And to kind of start us off, if you would, can you just talk, for those who might not be familiar with a lot of your research, can you start us off talking about racial trauma and social culture trauma and what that means for us, what it is and kind of what it means for us to be looking at it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think most of us are familiar with the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And usually we think about PTSD in relation to people who have been in combat or have been raped, but people can get PTSD from just about, any kind of traumatizing event, as in even something that doesn't seem like it should be traumatizing. If it happens often enough, it can be traumatizing, such as, say, sexual harassment or bullying. These are concepts that we know that we can easily connect to traumatization. But, and the same is true of racism, and this is where racial trauma fits in, is that experiencing racism often enough, whether they're major experiences or small ones, eventually results in traumatization, no different than people who might have been in war. If you think about the experience of Black Americans, I think many of us could identify with the notion that it is like living in a combat zone at times. You don't know who your friends or enemies are. People who are supposed to protect you might kill you. So we're constantly subjected to stereotyping and profiling and having our integrity and intelligence questioned. So I believe that every person of color in this country has some degree of racial traumatization. So I wouldn't say, do you have it or don't you? Our question is how much, really. And certainly different minority groups are treated differently, but we're all subjected to harmful stereotypes. And so with African Americans actually receiving the most racism and discrimination and being subject to the worst stereotypes. So,
what stands out to me is that there is a specific kind of violence that we don't think about that comes with just being ourselves. And can you talk a little bit more about the kind of violence? Because sometimes when we think about war, we're thinking guns and just being out front and actually being suited up in our armor or in our uniforms, and having some sort of protection. So can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like? If we're not actually in a physical war zone, but we're in more of a mental war zone.
Right. So, I can think of many examples, and, and certainly some of these are more serious than others. I think we all probably saw the news story a few months ago about the two Black gentlemen who were at Starbucks waiting for a friend, and they had the police called on them. Even when bystanders said these guys didn't do anything, the police still arrested them and took them away. And even though they were released, how humiliating and frightening that must be to just simply be minding your own business. And at the drop of a hat, anyone can pick up the phone and have you hauled away for no reason. That's a form of violence right there. And I have to guarantee if the tables were turned and a Black guy working at the register called the police because two white women were standing there waiting for a friend, I can't imagine what universe a cop would have arrested them and taken them away. So it's dangerous just to simply exist in our society. And that danger You never know where it's going to come from. And so that creates anxiety, which is a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. It generates hypervigilance because you're always looking around for danger. And you feel like you don't know who you can trust, which creates a sense of alienation and being cut off from others. And again, these are all common PTSD symptoms that racism fuels. And so that's maybe perhaps a more extreme example, although it happens all the time, and I don't want to understate how common things like these are. But I can give you another example where, say, one of my graduate students said that she was at a Starbucks, and she was waiting in line, and she placed her order and turned around and accidentally bumped a white woman behind her. Not very hard, just like bumped her purse. And she says, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to bump into you. I'm sorry." And the woman just looked at her and said, "I bet you are," just this hate in her face and in her expression, right? So, so even an interaction like that, that's still aggression, that's still violence, even though that person didn't pick up a billy club and hit her. It's a form of harm. And so even experiences like that, where there was nothing physical involved, but still there's an attack on the person's character, and that person's treated like they're worthless, or the second class citizen, or something like this. So.
Well, and that actually is, I think, especially the idea that you just trying to live, and not being able to just do a regular thing, is completely traumatizing, and also just something that it makes you have to rework your ritual. I'm really obsessed with ritual, and so it makes it seem as if your ritual has to be interrupted, or there are all of these disruptions that happen to you. And I think that, and I'm guessing, I'm wondering too about, like, when all those kinds of disruptions start to happen, then how do people then start to act out? Like, how does that then start to be reflective in their moods, and then there's just kind of the ways that people are, or even people's ideas of what their ability is to achieve in the world, and to do when it's hard to do just regular things.
Right. So, so this is an interesting question too. And, we know that, the research shows us that, an accumulation of experiences of racism causes symptoms that are pretty much like PTSD. How do you heal from that? We have several empirically validated treatments just for PTSD, but are those interventions effective for people who have suffered due to racism? And we don't know that. We don't know that they are. So, and so as a result, knowing that there's not like, okay, here's the gold standard treatment book for if you're suffering from racial trauma, right? So we're all really just trying to figure it out on our own, how to survive and cope. And we find people have different kinds of coping strategies for these things. And you can broadly classify these as adaptive coping versus dysfunctional coping. And dysfunctional coping can look like substance abuse. It could look like irritability. It could look like depression. It could look like isolation, or for young people, acting out, or what we call emotional constriction, where people it's just too painful to feel anymore, so they just turn off the knob and they feel disconnected from their emotions, can't cry if they wanted to. I can't tell you how many Black men I've talked to who are now in a state of emotional constriction as a result of, a lifetime of this kind of treatment.
Right. And then I'm guessing too, and especially when you're speaking about healing, and we'll talk about social media in just a few minutes, because some of that too plays a large part in the difficulties of healing. So how do people start to heal? Because especially in the Black community, when you talk about going to therapy, people are like, no, that's not what we do. That's not how we deal with things. And especially even even when you do go to therapy, if there are not a lot of therapists of color or someone who looks like you or understands your culture, then it's kind of hard to do the healing work because your resources aren't always there. Can you speak a little bit about that particular experience as well?
Yeah, it's a good question because, I mean, I'm a licensed psychologist, so I do therapy. I teach students how to do therapy, and you're absolutely right. If the therapist doesn't understand experiences of oppression, of racism, then they're not going to be particularly effective in helping people who've suffered. And and there are definitely like a lot of traumatic things people experience, and the therapist doesn't have to have experienced those traumatic things to know how to help a person normally. But it's like there's a different rule book when it comes to racism, because most of the mental health workforce, most of them are white people, and we know that in our culture, white people are socialized not to see racism. So even if I put it right in your face, here's some racism, it's like almost they have trouble seeing it and understanding it. And there are actually a lot of social forces, within white American culture that prevent them from processing that knowledge and changing the way they think. So a person of color who goes to try to get help for this with a white therapist, or someone who doesn't have good training or understanding of issues of stigma and oppression, they might not only be unhelpful, they may actually be harmful. They may actually contribute to the traumatization that the person is coming for help for. So I do think it is a bit risky to just say open the phone book and pick a therapist and say, oh, help me with my racial trauma. I would never recommend that. I would never refer somebody for this to somebody that I didn't know personally, or that I didn't train personally, because there is that danger. And so, I would recommend that people of color find therapists in their own communities to work with. And that doesn't guarantee that person will know how to help them, but I think it improves the odds by quite a lot. And have those conversations early with the therapist to make sure that they are comfortable and competent, working with you surrounding those issues of racism and racial trauma.
Right. So, I could ask you a lot more questions about that, but I do kind of want to talk a little bit about, in addition to PTSD, you also talked some about and have written some about post-traumatic slave syndrome. And can you talk to us a little bit about that? And then I want us to start talking about just some of the more things that are happening in social media and how we're posting and things like that.
Yeah, well, I can't take credit for coining the term post-traumatic slave syndrome, but I can talk a little bit about how our traumatic cultural history even contributes to traumatization today, because for most African Americans, they came to this country not by choice, not because they wanted to find a better life or have religious freedom, but because they were kidnapped from their homes and brought over on ships where many died and forced into servitude for the rest of their lives under brutal conditions, where families were routinely torn apart, where women didn't have any power over their bodies, and men were emasculated. So also there was a cultural genocide in place, as well, as the slaves were forbidden to speak their native languages or partake in their customs from their native countries, and their names were changed. So this is all traumatic. Any one of these things is traumatic, but the slaves endured all of these things and then some. So we have a whole nation of Black Americans who were traumatized and living in a state of trauma, and then passing their trauma on to the next generation, which was also traumatized by American culture. And so one thing we know is when people are traumatized, that they pass that on to their children through different mechanisms, through social mechanisms, and now we're even learning through genetic mechanisms as well, through epigenetics, that trauma is passed on. So we are here today. We're not enslaved, we're not kidnapped from our homelands, but that trauma still lives in our bodies and in our minds. So that's another piece of the puzzle that's another piece that needs to be healed as well.
Right. And I'm I can imagine that it takes probably just as many generations to unpack it and to combat it as it did just for what has already been passed down onto us, because then we're also opening up new things, such as social media. Because like I do remember a while ago there was the exhibit Without Sanctuary, in the book Without Sanctuary, and they talked about how in 1908 there was a law passed, that the U.S. Postal Service passed, so that you couldn't no longer pass around postcards and could not pass around images of lynchings and things of that nature. But nothing like that exists today. And quite honestly, a lot of times now, because of social media, is the only reason that some things have, because of social media is the only reason that some things have even been addressed. And so can you talk a little bit about just social media itself, and how it relates to trauma, especially seeing some of these traumatic images over and over again?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a problem. It's very traumatizing for us as a community to see people like us shot and killed by police with no retribution, left dead on the street like roadkill, you know, beaten and abused, even children, and then knowing, and I think the worst part of it is, again, that there's no justice, right? So these things happen, and they don't bring about change, and so then the end result of that is that our bodies, Black bodies, are entertainment. And that's been the problem. That's been a problem from the beginning. With, you mentioned the lynching postcards. Well, this is no different. These are just animated lynching postcards. And so, of course, those are traumatic to us because we have a whole history of Black bodies as entertainment for the masses, and it continues. And it continues on Facebook and on, you know, news channels. Every time you see a Black person murdered by police.
Yeah. And so I think the use of the word entertainment is, I guess I'd never thought about it that way, but I guess it would be kind of like a living horror film to watch over and over again, to some degree. And I'm guessing, especially with working with how the media and how technology is doing it, is there a way that we even as ourselves can try to control it, or even control our intake, or kind of regulate it? And what kinds of things can we do to kind of help that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the less we consume it, the better, because when people are watching and reading this stuff, it only fuels the media to keep putting it out there because they make money on it, right? So, and so when I say, you know, violence against Blacks is entertainment, I'm not kidding. So, you know, they're profiting on our bodies being abused, beaten, and killed, and we need to speak out against it and say, no, please, this is not, you know, you need to find a way to tell this story and let the humanity of this individual stay intact. Now, certainly, I think there is a place for these videos with the attorneys and Justice Department and the families, but not social media. And you also have to think about, what does that mean to a child whose father has been killed by police, to see that image repeating itself over and over again on their cell phones and iPads, right? So these are people's, you know, partners and sons and brothers and uncles and cousins. They're human beings, and this is not the way that you show that you respect a person or show that they have dignity. And I pose this question often when I talk about this, as I say, okay, so I bet you many of you can name many Black people you've seen killed on social media. How many white people have you seen killed on social media? Most people can't think of one, right? So why is it that, and white people do get killed by police too. I mean, the police they're insane sometimes. Lots of white people get killed who shouldn't get killed, particularly people who have mental illness. Mm-hmm. We don't see them being killed on camera. Why is that? Because those bodies are afforded more respect.
Right. So, and it sounds then that it can become kind of pornographic in some ways where it is very voyeuristic and it's really hard pushing. And I think that is an excellent point too, that like the kind of bodies that you are seeing that are that death becomes regular. So it then what does it do in real life if you see someone die in real life? You're like, okay, well I've seen that already. It kind of numbs you to it. And I'm wondering too, because you did say something about that there was a place for videos such as these, because well, and I just want to clarify, you're saying that that even if the videos do happen, because they do have a place and they are important, but there is also a way that they can be used to help. Can you talk a little bit about the ways that they could be used to help a situation, instead of further harming and traumatizing people?
Right, right. Well, so when this footage first started to become available, originally I thought this was a good thing because I thought, oh, everybody's going to see what these crooked cops are doing. Everyone's going to see that this guy didn't deserve to die. And then we'll have all of this social change will come from it. Well, guess what? Didn't happen, right? So cops are now, they all have these body cams, but has this changed anything? Have any of those cops who have shot innocent Black people, have they been put in jail or prosecuted? Has there been justice? There's not been justice. The vast majority, 99% of the cops who do this, nothing happens to. And in fact, some of these crooked cops, they don't even, not even talking about just killing people, they may routinely brutalize, injure, traumatize people. There may be a file of complaints against them this big. And the cities would rather pay out millions of dollars to settle those complaints than fire the cops who are doing these things. So what does that tell you? That tells you they're so invested in their system of dominance that they would rather take that money out of taxpayers' pockets to maintain that system of dominance rather than to bring in a system that is equitable. So what we're seeing is really just a more pronounced version of what's been going on all along. And that doesn't help anyone, and it definitely contributes to fear and disenfranchisement and trauma in our communities.
Yeah, and it also even makes me think about too, even broader than Black Lives Matter. I think about a lot of videos where you see people posting just videos of the homeless and what the homeless are doing, and then a lot of the videos that were happening. Just like with Standing Rock in Puerto Rico, when the hurricane in Puerto Rico happened, and just areas that were also just, places or environments that seem to be destroyed or disrupted. And those are the only images that were given of certain groups. And so it seems to also just expand past in so many different ways and it seems to be so complex then.
Yes, it is. And it's funny, the other day I was doing I was in a conference room. We were doing it was a hiring committee. We were interviewing people for jobs at our university. And in the room, there were all these huge framed pictures of disadvantaged Black children, someplace, I assume in Africa, with a little plastic plate of food that I imagine some benevolent white worker had given to them. And, and you could see they're like, clearly impoverished, and the one that's got snot coming down his nose, and it's like, and there's like 7 of these huge framed pictures in the room, all Black kids, right? Every single one. And it's like, okay, why are they only Black kids? And what message does this communicate about Blacks and Black children, right? That we're all impoverished and we need help from white people. And that's the image people have in their minds, and they love that. Because it reinforces the stereotypes. And I would argue that these are incredibly racist. You've never in a million years seen impoverished white kid framed in a picture with aid workers, giving them food on a plastic plate. You don't see it. I mean, it happens in the world. There are lots of places where there's impoverished white kids. Mm-hmm. But again, it doesn't propagate the myth.
Right. And I think that actually kind of touches on something I wanted to also to ask you about, because we are talking about churches, and a lot of the all of the Church Uniting in Christ is made up of many different denominations, some that are predominantly white, some that are predominantly black, some that are predominantly Hispanic, are all different kinds. And when we're thinking about that, and historically missionaries have been the ones going into a lot of the places and taking the pictures and posting the work that they're doing. So can you speak a little bit about how the kind of responsibility that faith communities have in maybe helping with reducing some of the trauma if possible, and what they can possibly do to well, I guess we can just start there with like the kinds of things that they can start to do to maybe help with this, to correct some things that have happened in the past, and to maybe move forward in their bodies and their communities.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think it's important and wonderful that people go to impoverished areas and help those communities. And at the same time, we have to make sure that we're not using this as a photo op, that these people are not being tokenized, right? Because you have to think about, what is the message? Is this empowering to these people, or is it just voyeurism, right? So I think that's the question you have to ask. And that when we're doing this work, I think it's so important that we're partnering with these communities rather than just sort of coming down like from on high, like, okay, we know what you need, and then that's what we're going to do, and you just better be thankful. I think that those communities must have a voice in whatever help we're bringing them.
Right. And so it sounds like it should be less of kind of a hierarchical, but more of a vertical partnership kind of situation, where actually having a conversation and a dialogue about how the help can be useful if the help is even wanted.
Right.
And it makes me wonder about how faith communities can deal with the rejection of, because I mean, at some point they might be rejected in there as well.
Yeah, well, sometimes that help isn't helpful, and people haven't taken the time to learn what those communities want or need before they bring in their help. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an important piece of it. And then recognizing that there are people in those communities that have knowledge that should be respected and treated as equals in the process of bringing help or aid.
Right. And so in terms of, for example, if there are churches that are looking at different ways of going out and doing some preventive work, or even if there is a community that's saying, hey, we've caused some sort of trauma, how then do we help erase that? Is there anything that you can recommend as a resource for them to kind of work with, or at least a way to start that conversation?
Yeah, right. So I find that if we're going to work with people in other cultural groups, we have to include people from those groups on our teams. And I think anything other than that is arrogance. So, I'm not going to go into a new community and pretend I understand them and their needs. If I'm going to really do due diligence to what's needed, and I'm going to create a relationship with that community, I'm going to invest in it, and I'm going to put people from that community on my team because I need their perspectives. And then also that facilitates buy-in from the communities and helps you cover your blind spots, because we're going to all have blind spots in any culture we're not born into. You're going to have blind spots. So it ensures a level of cultural humility.
Yeah. And so just to kind of pair back what you were saying, the real emphasis on is making sure that there is a cultural humility and before going into a culture that is not our own, and recognizing that we aren't the expert on the place that we're just learning about.
Right. Exactly. And I got to tell you, in psychology, psychological research, you see so much of that. I'll read articles or go to talks, and people will say, yeah, we really wanted to do this intervention in this community, and they didn't come, or they dropped out, and we have no idea why. And we were offering all these incentives, and people just wouldn't come. And I guess they just don't care about this work because, we tried really hard. And I was like, and I'll just say, so how diverse was your research team? Mm-hmm. And inevitably, right. Anybody, right. Not one person from that cultural group, period, much less that community. Mm-hmm. So of course they didn't know what they were doing. I mean, I can usually tick off 10 things they did wrong, just, in 5 seconds. And if they had bothered to ask somebody who actually knew that stuff, they could have prevented sometimes millions and millions of taxpayers' money being wasted, in these federal grants that people get to do this work.
Right. And I think that's interesting. I used to work at a college, and we used to have this joke about, oh, well, that was a decision that was made without a person of color in the room. You can tell when you walk in the door. And it's especially in light of what just happened last week, even gender-wise, with the Kavanaugh trial, and with Dr. Ford coming forward. You can just tell also there's just conversations and things that are happening without those persons in the room. And I kind of feel like, especially even with this racial trauma, you can also see how some of these also things can translate over into other traumas as well. I'm someone in my denomination who is considered to be on the younger scale. And so sometimes we're like, y'all made decisions without our voices.
Yeah.
So like, how do you and how do you encourage people to have that conversation and to be cognizant of, hey, there's more than just you in this space. It might sound good, but you can't impose that on people.
Yeah. And it's actually funny you should mention that, because I really believe that the younger cohort should be charting the course for the future, because you guys are going to be living in it, right? The older generation, they're going to be gone. Right. So I feel like you guys should be charting the course, and the older generation should be helping you get there and saying, here's some ways our wisdom and knowledge can help you achieve this. But the older generation, they should not be dictating the direction.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I definitely agree. And even in the past, if you look at other movements, even just kind of how Black Lives Matter started out on Facebook, that is actually indicative of a lot of the past movements anyway. Like a lot of civil rights movements, a lot of those guys when they first started were under 30, or, SNCC and SCLC and all of those groups were all younger generations who were coming in. So it wasn't, it wasn't the elders leading. It was very typically the younger ones leading, and then everyone else kind of fell into it. So, yeah. So, and I'm going to open it up for questions in just 1 second. So if you have some, go ahead and please start typing your questions in the box if you have any. And before we get to that point, can you just tell us, for those of us who have been bombarded with so many images, and wondering how to stay positive on Facebook and in social media and Instagram and all those places, and just trying to live as people, what kind of things would you recommend in terms of us considering self-care, and starting to deal with and heal from the trauma that we may have experienced?
Yeah. Well, first I would say, limit exposure to social media. Don't watch that thing over and over again. If you want to read the story, fine, but you can't let all of these images pollute your mind, when there's so much more important things to do. And the other thing I would say is, like, get support from people who get it, right? So I think all of us probably know people or have friends, and you go to them and you say, this really stressful racist thing happened to me, and they might be like, oh, suck it up, or that didn't really happen, or, oh, that's nothing compared to what I went through when I was a kid. I lived in segregation, right? That's my parents. Right? So don't go to those people. Go to the ones who are going to be empathetic and supportive and energize you. And most of you know who those people are in your lives, right? And get get your batteries recharged. And then I would say self-care is so important. And I think we as Black people are really bad at that. And it's essential, because it's basically how you got to fill your tank, right? Otherwise, what happens to a car if you don't put gas in it, right? It stops on the road at some point, and you need the tow truck. So don't wait until you need a tow truck. Get the gas, get the regular checkups, right? And so that means doing things that you find relaxing, and that energize you, and that uplift you. And so that includes things like exercise. It includes things like just basic things like 3 meals a day. Like, don't skip breakfast and lunch. Don't do that to yourself. It includes a spiritual life, and I think that's critical for everyone. And even people, I know I have clients, some of them don't believe in God, and I say, okay, well, find something that fills you with awe and wonder. Okay, you need that. You need to recognize that the universe is big, and it's not all about you, right? It's very easy to get locked into a very narrow frame of reference, when you've got a lot of stressful things happening, and it's really important to be able to step out of that from time to time and take vacations. You'd be surprised Maybe you wouldn't be. How many Americans don't even use up all their vacation days at work? Use the dang vacation days, okay?
Yeah.
Go travel, take some time off, do a staycation if you have to. So these are all good things. I believe in retail therapy. So I when I get stressed, I like to go shopping. I like to shop for furniture. I know that's expensive, but I have a clinic, so I have an excuse.
Right.
Like, okay, you know what? I need a new chair. Oh, I'm gonna go do that. Get my stuff. I like to get a manicure. So I like to get a massage. Maybe that's not your thing, but something to help you unwind regularly, like not once a year. So yeah. So those are some important things, and I think also it's important when you hear negative things and this is why I think it's so important that every Black person know Black history, because when you hear about all the negative things, you need to have a reservoir of positive things about us and our culture that you can draw from, so that you don't ingest all of that, all those pathological renditions of us as a people. I think African Americans is a beautiful culture. We're resilient people. We're strong people. We're beautiful people. We've got a great sense of humor. We find ways to make ends meet, and we're loving and generous. And it's important to affirm those things about us, and not buy into the lies that are everywhere.
No, and I absolutely agree with that. And actually, and this kind of ties into the question that was asked. I think I'm not sure who actually asked it, but it says, "What is your favorite self-care activity?" And it says it's for both of us. And so I think you started to answer it about manicures and retail therapy. But is there any other self-care activity that you would recommend? That's just yours. That whatever it is that you own.
Yeah, well, this is okay. So this is a self-care activity you can't do regularly, but for years, my sister, she lives in Berlin. She's invited me to come visit her in the summer and go sailing. And I've never been sailing before. I did take a sailing class in college, which was terrifying because it was this little boat. It was on the Charles River. They said if you fall in, you have to get a tetanus shot. And it wasn't fun. And it was really frightening. So I said to my sister, I'm really not feeling the sailing thing. And because I don't know how to sail, and I don't want to, fall in water, and, my hair wet, whatever. And she's like, no, you don't understand. No, there's going to be two hot guys that are going to be doing all the sailing stuff. We're just going to lay on the deck. I'm like, oh, okay. So we went sailing, and I thought we went sailing for a week and a half, and on Lake Constance, which is on the border of Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. And I laid out on the deck. I thought, I'm going to get bored. Maybe I should bring my laptop. I didn't ever crack open my laptop. It was just fantastic. It was beautiful. The air was fantastic. The sky was fantastic. The water was wonderful. And it was like so recharging. I'm just like, man, why haven't I done this sooner?
Yeah. For me, I am also a traveler, but one of my favorite things to do, and it seems so simple, I turn my cell phone off. I have a day a week, and it's not like a true 24 hours, like 12 to 4 either. It's like 4 o'clock on Sunday to 4 o'clock on Monday.
Wow.
And I'll either put it on silent, or at the very minimum, I do no work. But there is a time where I'm like, I'm going to turn it off, and I'm going to let it go. And so I don't care what people have said. It can be done before that time or after that time. And people know that they're not going to get work out of me during that 24-hour time frame. And outside of that, I just, I like to watch plays. So I go watch plays all the time, travel and do that. And I think those are my favorite self-care activities. But I think the cell phone one has become my most favorite, I think, lately, because it's something about being able to detach just a little bit. Sometimes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. One thing I was really excited to discover on my phone last year was like the do not disturb thing. So I programmed it to not, so it won't ring or buzz or tweet or anything. I can set it from like 10 at night to 8 in the morning. I will not be disturbed. And before that, it was always, like even like late at night, I was checking it and stuff. And then when I did that, I'm like, wow, you know what? Whatever's happening between those hours, I don't need to know about it. So, but I admire you that you could do it a whole day. That's impressive. I can aspire to that. I don't see that. I don't see myself being able to quite make it there, but I'm impressed.
It's hard. It isn't, there's some days where I'm just like, I can't get all the hours, but I get some. Like every week I'm like, I have to do some. And that's really important. So, yeah. Are there any other questions as we're talking? I haven't seen any others pop up so far, but feel free to type. And I think you might be able to actually raise your hand here too. So if you raise your hand and I see you, then I can kind of peg you in so you can ask your question. All right. While we're waiting, oh, hold on. Yes, there's a question about microaggressions in the worship place. And microaggressions. And I guess if I can get a little bit more clarity on it, are we, in terms of microaggressions in a worship place, are we talking about, I'm assuming it's across race, across gender, across even sexuality lines in the worship place, because all those things do come up. Can you? Yeah, I was told all of that. So can you speak a little bit about first microaggressions themselves, because it goes back to what you talked about at the very beginning. But if we can just kind of name what those are and then talk about how they kind of manifest themselves in all of our areas of life.
Yeah, right. So microaggressions are sort of these small indignities that we have to continually suffer just because we're people of color. So they can be little acts of disrespect or not being seen. I can describe 5 microaggressions in the last week that I experienced. Like I went to a park with my son where the zip lining, and then there's assistants who put your harness on for you. And like literally there was like a batch of 10 of us. I got my harness. Everyone else had their harness on and they were practicing. I was still waiting for someone to help me with my harness. There were 2 guys there who were doing it. A new couple came. They got served while I was still standing there. And then after everybody had their harness on, like one of them looked at me and said, "Oh, I didn't even see you." Right? I mean, I was like completely invisible to them. As a Black woman, like I think we're like the most invisible group of human beings in the country. And I mean, and I don't think they meant, I don't think anybody was like, okay, we'll make her go last because she's a Black woman. I don't think it was like that. But like it just didn't register that I was someone they should serve. So these things are happening all the time. And then sometimes there are little remarks, that show racial insensitivity or just cluelessness, or sometimes there are other actions. I was in South Carolina giving grand rounds at the Medical University of South Carolina, and I was sitting on a bench waiting for my colleague to pick me up, and there was a white woman about 2 feet away on her laptop. And in a span of about 5 minutes, she slowly turned her whole body like away from me, like literally away from me. It had to be uncomfortable because it was a bench. But for some reason, like my presence there was just like so aversive that she like didn't even want me to be in her line of vision, that she had turned her whole body, So things like that are always happening, right? And in any one instance, you don't always know 100% if it was an act of discrimination, but they're happening so often that it's not all by accident. And so these things are happening constantly, and it would be surprising if they didn't happen in church, right? But what needs to be different about what happens in church is that people need to be free to bring it up and to talk about it, and perpetrators need to be humble and apologize, rather than sort of the knee-jerk defensive reaction that usually happens.
Right. And that humility, I think, is the key, or is also probably the difficulty, because even when in church, I think that especially in worship places, then once you start to get a certain status, then and especially if there's a certain hierarchy, and if there's a, for example, you become chairman of the deacons board or one of the stewards, or you are the pastor, then those things can be perpetuated, and especially if they go, I guess, unchecked, because at a certain point, not having something checked is really the point also where humility doesn't come in. If you feel as if you cannot, if you're above the law and above that particular space. But I also see that too. And I hope that answers the question. So I also see that too, though, even kind of getting back to social media, this idea of people who get fired off of what they post on Facebook and then saying, oh, well, I didn't mean it that way, and I didn't think you were going to see this, or this, that, and the other, or the memes that come out, and you're just like, well, were you paying attention to what this meant? You know, oh, and I didn't mean it. And so I think that might also be a part of how some of the microaggressions even have manifested themselves in public, even. But that's, but I think that especially microaggressions in the workplace, it's a matter of being able to call it out and trying to feel like, because worship is supposed to be a safe space already, churches are supposed to be a safe space. And I think the difficulty comes in where you feel as if now something has happened in this space that's supposed to be safe and it's no longer safe. And I would even ask too, I guess I could ask even a follow-up to that. And I know we talked about just that humility bit, but is there another way, in addition to the humility, that people can go about starting to say, well, let's try to restore a safe space once it's been broken?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's the responsibility, like, of every leader to invite people to say, look, this is a tough area. We're not all going to get it right. I'm going to make mistakes. When I do, I'm counting on you to let me know so that I can repair the damage and we can move forward together with an improved relationship. I think that's essential, because the thing about microaggressions, one of the things that makes them so harmful is that when someone levies a microaggression at you, you're not free to reject it, right? You can't. That's the hard thing, because as soon as you bring it up, you get socially punished for it. And that's where the power differential comes in. So the person with the greater power has to be willing to say and follow this with their actions, that they want to be told, and that they're going to be humble when they are told, and that they're going to try to make it right.
Right. And do you think, and I've seen this happen sometimes, well, especially like when churches have started going overhauls, I've seen churches might bring in like outside workshop leaders and outside persons. Like I remember my church at home, when we were talking about trying to change the environment of the church, then they brought in people to talk about radical hospitality and to kind of start having conversations about how to not only work on ourselves, but to welcome others. Do you also recommend that sometimes too, if that's needed? I
think every group could benefit from some training on how to do these things better. So I say it's always needed. and it's sensible, proactive thing to do it before there's a crisis. And especially like a church, if you want your church to be like a multicultural place that's safe for everybody, you're going to have to work hard to make it really safe for everybody, because, the rest of the week we're all going around in our, socio-cultural hierarchy, where certain people are more privileged than others, and they have no reason to expect when they come to church they are not going to be privileged in that way anymore. So we have to put everybody on notice that, here we're all equal, and then ideally you take that out to church with you too. But it takes conscious effort and work to learn to give up privilege. But that's exactly what Christ did. So what better example, right, of giving up privilege?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Christ was it. Are there any others who have questions before? You can type them in the chat or even in the Q&A. I'm not seeing any, but is there anything that I know we've asked I asked you a lot of questions today, and we engaged in wonderful conversation. Is there anything you'd like to add before before we end, I'm just looking at the time and we don't see any other questions, but is there anything else you'd like to still add to this conversation?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I want to make it clear that, like all kinds of racism, microaggressions can be harmful and traumatic. Again, because it's again like that accumulated trauma, like from sexual harassment or bullying. Same thing with microaggressions. So I know we all experience them really often, and we learn to brush them off or not deal with them. But I don't think that this is the way, because every time we let a microaggression go, for one, that is an act of violence against us. But also that person who's doing the microaggression, well, they don't know that they've done something hurtful. So then they're going to go and keep doing it to other people. And so even if we're not necessarily doing it for ourselves, we're doing it for everybody when we call out microaggressions when we see them. Because that'll make it less likely that that person will do that again to somebody else. And the microaggressions, they've been going on since the 1960s, when Dr. Chester Pierce was the first one to identify and name them and describe them. He's a Black Harvard psychiatrist. And they haven't stopped. They're still going on. So that tells me they're not going to stop on their own. We're going to have to stop them ourselves. And, when we would hope that, it would be nice if white people would stop doing these things. But, again, we can't just hope that that's going to happen. And those of us who experience these things, it's important that we speak up against them, even though it's not easy and there will be a cost.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming on and sharing with us. Thank you, all of you panelists and attendees as well. Those of you who joined us, and thank you, Megan, Reverend Megan Dean Tobula. Oh my gosh, I don't know how to pronounce your last name yet. Tobola. Thank you so much for doing the tech work for us and making sure that we were on and here. So everyone, thank you so much. Again, this is a series, it's the Long Haul Part 2, and we will actually be going for the next 3 Wednesdays talking about mental health in various different ways. So please do tune back in and make sure you sign up on the website, churchesunitinginchrist.com, I believe it is, /18 webinar series, and you will be able to tune in and see those as well. So thank you all so much and have a wonderful week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.